Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I write for a living, which means I spend more time than most people thinking about what it means for words to be on a page, where they came from, who put them there, and why and what the putting there required of the person doing it. Language doesn't arrive. It gets made by someone through effort with intent. That's the foundational assumption of everything I do professionally, and it's so deeply embedded in how I think about the world that I didn't have a framework for the journal at first. I kept trying to apply the foundational assumption, and the journal kept not fitting it. And the gap between those two things is where the fear came from. Not the fear of something monstrous, the fear of something that understood what it was doing better than I understood what was being done to me. We'd been in the house for 2 years when I started pulling the drywall in the back bedroom. The room had a moisture problem that traced to a section of exterior wall, and the contractor I called gave me a quote that suggested he'd confused our house for a much larger one. So I watched some videos and decided to handle the demo myself. The repair I'd leave to someone who knew what they were doing. The demo was just destruction, and I could manage destruction. The journal was inside the wall, between the insulation and the exterior sheathing, in a space where it had no business being. Not dropped in accidentally, set in deliberately in a small depression that might have been made for it. A hardcover notebook, dark green, swollen with old moisture, but intact. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while before I opened it. The first entry was dated 1931. This house had been built in 1947. I sat down. The early entries were in 3 different hands across what I estimated was 30 or 40 years of writing. The first hand was cramped and precise, the handwriting of someone who'd learned penmanship when penmanship was a formal subject. The entries it wrote were personal, a man's daily life, his work, his observations about his property and the people on it, ordinary material, the kind of things someone writes in a journal when they're trying to account for their days. What was strange about them wasn't the content, it was the tense. Every entry was written in past tense, present-day observations recorded as though they were being written from the other side of the day rather than in it. Not, I am going to the mill today, but I went to the mill. Not, it looks like rain, but it rained. The journal described days that had already happened in the voice of someone looking back from some point after. Except the entries stopped mid-decade. The last entry in the first hand was dated 1938 and ended mid-sentence. Not an incomplete thought. The sentence itself stopped, as though the hand had put down the pen before finishing. The second hand picked up a year later. A different person. Same property, same tense, same quality of daily documentation. This hand wrote for about 12 years, and its last entry also ended mid-sentence, also mid-decade. The third hand overlapped with the construction of the house based on the dates and wrote through the early years of the building's existence. It ended the same way. I turned to the page after the third hand's last entry, expecting blank pages. The fourth hand was mine. I know my handwriting. I've been looking at it for 37 years. I know the way my lowercase g closes slightly too tight, and the way my capital letters run a little tall, and the specific way I form the number 4 with an open top. The entry on the page after the third hand's last entry was written in my handwriting, in my specific voice, describing my day. It described finding the journal. It described bringing it inside. It described sitting at the kitchen table and reading through the earlier entries with the specific sequence of reactions I had, in the order I had them, including a thought I'd had while reading the first hand's entries that I hadn't said out loud, a thought about the tense of the writing. It described everything through the end of the day, past the point at which I was currently sitting, into evening and sleep. I read it to the end. Then I set the journal on the table, and I got up and I went outside and stood on the back porch for a while. I know what the obvious test is. I don't need to explain it to anyone who has spent any time thinking about what I'd just found. The entry described me doing specific things in a specific order for the rest of the day. If I did those things, it proved nothing. The entry might be an accurate description of what I would have done regardless of whether I'd read it. If I didn't do those things, if I broke from the described sequence, that would tell me something useful. The entry described me eating dinner at the kitchen table. I ordered food and ate it on the back porch. Or I tried to. I carried my food to the back porch and sat down and got about 3 bites in, and something in the mechanics of the evening shifted in a way I couldn't articulate, a quality of wrongness in the deviation. And I picked up my plate and went inside and sat at the kitchen table and finished eating. Not because I decided to, because the decision I'd made to eat on the porch had somehow failed to take, the way a foot doesn't find the step it thought was there. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what had just happened. And I thought about it in the careful way I thought about technical problems at work, and I arrived at a conclusion I didn't want. I hadn't failed to eat on the porch because something stopped me. I'd failed because the entry said I'd eat at the kitchen table, and the entry was not describing my choices. It was producing them. Nadia got home at 7, which is what the entry said. She asked about the drywall, which is what the entry said. I told her about the journal, which is what the entry said. I watched her face move through the expressions the entry had described. Interest, then skepticism, then the specific look she got when she was deciding whether to take something seriously. And I thought about the fact that I was watching a document come true in a real time, and I hadn't written a word of it. She read the earlier entries. She read my entry. She asked the questions the entry said she'd ask. I gave the answers the entry said I'd give. Not because I was trying to follow it, but because they were the answers I had. She went to bed at 10, which is what the entry said. I stayed up reading the older entries again, which is what the entry said. I found the part about Nadia at 11 o'clock at night, which is exactly when the entry said I would. The entry for the following day was already written when I turned the page. It had been written at some point while I was reading. Not before I'd gone to bed. I'd checked. The page had been blank when I looked, and now it wasn't. It described my Tuesday with the same completeness as my Monday. Same tense, same voice, same handwriting that was mine without being produced by me. Nadia appeared in the Tuesday entry. Her name, her morning, a conversation we'd have over breakfast. and near the end of the entry, a line about her that I read twice before I understood what I was reading. The line was not an ending, it was a trajectory, a description of something in Nadia's behavior that the entry noted with the neutral clinical observation of a writer noting a character development, not alarmed, not urgent, just recording, the way you'd record the early signs of a thing you'd seen develop before. I turned to the last entry of the third hand, the one that ended mid-sentence. I read the sentences before it. They were about a woman, his wife, I'd assumed from earlier entries. The entries about her in the days before the last one had the same quality as the line about Nadia, neutral, observational, recording something in her behavior that was changing. The trajectory of it developed over several entries, moved in a direction that the mid-sentence ending didn't resolve. I went back further into the third hand's entries, and I found the same pattern with the hand's own self-description. A gradual shift in the entry's quality, the voice becoming less present in them, the first person flattening out over weeks into something more reported than felt, like watching a narrator fade out of their own account. The second hand had the same arc. The first hand had the same arc. I sat at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night, and I understood the shape of what I'd found. I tried to destroy the journal in the morning. I want to be precise about what I tried because I want the record of it to be accurate. I tried to burn it in the kitchen sink with a lighter. The lighter worked. The journal did not catch. Not because the material was fire-resistant in any way I could identify. The pages were old and dry and should have gone up immediately. They didn't go up. The flame touched the cover and moved across it without leaving a mark, the way a flame moves across something that has already decided not to burn. I tried to put it in the trash. I carried it to the bin in the driveway, opened the lid, set the journal inside, closed the lid. I walked back to the house. The journal was on the kitchen table. I hadn't brought it back in. I know I hadn't brought it back in. My hands were empty when I walked inside, but it was on the table. I read that day's entry. It described me trying to burn the journal and failing. It described me walking to the trash bin and back. It described me standing in the kitchen for a long time afterward, which I did. And it described the specific thought I had during the standing, which I don't want to repeat here, because it was about Nadia and it was not a good thought to have. There is a section of the journal between the end of the first hand's entries and the beginning of the second hand's entries where the pages are blank. I had assumed these were simply unused pages. The journal sitting in the wall without anyone writing in it for the year between one hand and the next. I looked at them more carefully after my attempts to destroy the journal. I looked at them in good light, angled, the way you look at a page when you suspect there's something on it that isn't immediately visible. There was text on the pages, not ink, the absence of ink, the faint ghost of letters formed by the compression of the paper's fibers rather than by any mark on the surface. Writing that had been erased, or had erased itself, or had never been ink in the first place. I could make out words in places, enough words to understand that these pages had contained the continuation of the first hand's entries, running past the mid-sentence ending I'd found, past the point where the first hand had stopped. I could make out enough of the faded text to understand that the entries had continued without the first hand's knowledge. that they had described his days from the outside, the way mine described me from the outside, and that the descriptions had continued after a point at which the first hand had presumably stopped being able to produce them himself. I could make out the last legible phrase in the compressed fiber ghost of a handwriting I didn't recognize that described him in the third person. After that, the pages were blank. I spent a week not reading ahead. I read only the current day's entry, only after the day was done, and I told myself this was a form of resistance, not feeding the journal anything it hadn't already taken. Nadia didn't know I'd stopped reading ahead. I hadn't told her about the line in the Tuesday entry. I hadn't told her about the arcs in the older entries. I was protecting her from it, or I was protecting myself from having said it out loud, and I wasn't entirely sure which one. The week's entries were accurate, all of them. I stopped testing after Wednesday because testing had the quality of the journal watching me test, the quality of an author observing a character doing something the character thinks is autonomous. I didn't want to give it the satisfaction, which I recognized as an irrational thought about a notebook, and had anyway. On the 8th day, I read ahead. I read one entry forward, the entry for the following day, and it was ordinary, my work, a call I'd make, what I'd eat for lunch. Then I turned to the entry after it. Nadia's name was in the first line. I closed the journal. I've put it somewhere I won't find it easily. That's the most honest description of what I've done. I've put it in a location in the house that requires deliberate effort to reach, behind things I don't move often, in a part of the house I have no regular reason to go to. I've put it there because destroying it didn't work, and leaving it accessible was not something I was willing to do, and the option I had left was distance. The entry for the day I put it away described me putting it away. The location I chose was the location the entry described. I read the entry after I'd done it, the way I'd been doing, only current, only after, and the entry said what I'd done and where I'd put it and why. I don't know if the journal is writing ahead. I don't know if there are entries in it right now describing days I haven't lived yet. Nadia and me moving through a future that's already been authored in a handwriting I'd recognize as mine. I don't know if the earlier subjects put their journals away too, and whether that helped or whether it's just part of the arc, a chapter in the long patient account of what happens to the people on this property. I think about the blank pages between the first and second hands, what they contained before they became blank, and what it took to make them blank. I don't go to the part of the house where the journal is. I tell myself this is resistance. I tell myself I'm breaking the sequence, removing myself from the readership, and that the journal needs the readers the way certain things need witnesses, and that denying it that breaks the mechanism. I mostly believe that. What I believe less, on the days when I'm being precise in the way my work requires me to be precise, is that resistance and compliance might look the same from outside the narrative, that an author patient enough to have been writing the same story across the same piece of ground since 1931 has probably already written the chapter where the subject decides not to read ahead. Nadia is fine. She's fine right now, today, and I'm watching her the way I've been watching her for 3 weeks, the way you watch someone when you've read a single line about them in a document you're trying not to think about. She's fine, and she's herself. And the line I read was a line in a journal that I've put somewhere I won't find it easily. I work with language for a living. I know what it means for words to be on a page. I know what it means when the words got there without anyone putting them there. I know that the gap between those two things is where the fear lives, and I'm still standing in it. And the standing is either the bravest thing I've done or exactly what was written.